We're going to apply our knowledge of what we just learned about the inverse trig functions to solving inverse trig expressions, and then eventually using that to solve trig equations. So taking a look at the first example, example 1, that's split into sine, cosine, and tangent functions. There's a keyword that I want to focus on, which is find the exact value. So that means that without using a calculator and using your knowledge of the unit circle, we're going to answer the question that asks, what is the inverse sine of -1/2? Keeping in mind that our answer for sine and for tangent has a restriction on the range to be -π/2 to π/2. So if we're dealing with a number that is negative, we're going to provide an answer for, so if this is equal to y equals inverse sine of -1/2, our answer must fall into this range of -π/2 to π/2. So in other words, what angle measure, sine of what angle measure is equal to -1/2? Okay, so sine being negative puts us in the fourth quadrant. So the question is, what is an angle in the fourth quadrant between -π/2 and 0 that gives us -1/2 as an answer? And so hopefully you said -π/6. The reference angle is π/6. So negative sine of -π/6 falls between -π/2 and π/2, and it also provides us a value of -1/2. Inverse sine of radical 3/2. So this time, this value is positive, so that puts us in the first quadrant. So sine of what angle gets us radical 3/2, and that would be π/3. And so cosine, we're good in the first and the second quadrant. We can provide answers that are positive in the first quadrant or negative in the second quadrant. So cosine of what angle gets me -rad3/2. So because this is negative, that means that cosine, that angle measure is in the second quadrant. Let me clean this up here. So that means that you have an angle in the second quadrant that gives you a value of -rad3/2. So in thinking of the angle, what reference angle gives you radical 3/2? And hopefully you said π/6. So the angle measure in the second quadrant would be 5π/6. Cosine of 5π/6 gets us -rad3/2. Now keep in mind, you can't provide answers like, you can't say that my answer is 7π/6, which is in the third quadrant where cosine is also negative. Our answers must fall, if we're talking about inverse cosine, must fall between first and second quadrant only. So then the next question is, how do we find tangent? Tangent's the same as sine. It can be in the first and the fourth quadrant. -rad3, if you guys remember that trick that I had helped you out with, tangent of what angle equals -radical3 is the question. So since there's a single 3, it's π/3 is the reference angle. And since we're in since this value is negative radical 3, we are in the fourth quadrant. And so if we do a negative revolution, that's negative.